What's up guys, Chris Schwartz-edmisten here from Schwartz-edmisten Web Design. In today's video, we're going to look at this cool hover interaction where you can show boxes of content and display their corresponding image on the right on hover. And this is a CSS customization that we can write for auto layout sections. So I'm here in my 7.1 site. I have an auto layout section here on the page. And in terms of the content, you can see I just have 3 items here that have an image, a title, and a description. So you can imagine this would be a way to display like 3 of your services, for example. Now, this is a totally fine layout. You could just leave this as is, but this layout can get a little bit repetitive on your site. So that's why I want to go over this more custom layout that we're going to go over, where we have 3 items on the left and then you hover over each one and the respective image shows over here on the right. So in terms of the setup, all we need to do in the beginning is just make sure that the max columns are set to 2. And that's because we're going to position all of the text boxes over here on the left, and we just want to maintain some space for the image over here on the right. So I'll go ahead and save that. One other thing to note is I do have in the style panel, if we go to design, style, I have the card enabled. And that's just because I think the text looks a little bit better when it's in the box. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And we can get started on writing the CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is limit the CSS that we're writing to just this one section by targeting its data section ID. I have the Chrome block identifier plugin. Really helpful in terms of quickly getting data section IDs. So now I've pasted that in the custom CSS window. You can also find the data section ID on a section by right-clicking, clicking inspect, and then scrolling up to the section and then looking for the data section ID. So that's another way to get it. You can see it's here. And it's like ends in BA8, ends in BA8. So the extension is just a quicker way of finding the section's data section ID. And I think if you Google Squarespace block identifier extension, you should find the results for it. Okay, now that I've opened up curly brackets, any CSS I write between these curly brackets is only going to apply to this one section. So let's right click on the section and click inspect, and we can look at the kind of like HTML markup for this section. So basically we have this user items list container here. And if we toggle that open, I'll scroll all the way down. We have each of our items. So we have 3 items in here. And if I toggle open each item, an item is made up of the media. So that's the image, and then the content. So if I bring that over, you can see as I highlight the media, the image is highlighted and then the content is highlighted down below. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull the image out of each of the items, and we're going to place all of the images stacked on top of each other on the right. And then we're going to say when a list item is hovered over, make that list item's image visible. And it's that simple. So it just takes a little bit of work to pull each of the images out of the items and then position them properly over here on the right. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and target the list item media class, and we're going to go ahead and give it a position of absolute, and that'll pull it out of the document flow, and we can position absolute, and that just allows us to position it like physically wherever we want. And we want to position it relative to the container that these items are sitting in. So basically we want to position it relative to this container, and we want it to say, okay, start from the left and go 50%, and that's where we want the image to start. And then start at the top of this container, and we want the top to be 0. So basically we just have to position it relative to this container, and then we can tell it specifically where we want it to go. So for example, if I give it a property of left 50%, you can see it jumps over. And if I give it a top of 0, it's going way up above. And we don't want it to start at the top of the section. We want it to start at the top of that element. So that's why we have to then target the containing element that we want it to be positioned relative to. And we need to give it a position of relative. So I'm going to copy the class, this user items list simple class. and I'll say position relative. And now our absolutely positioned element, as we move it around and tell it where to go, it's going to be moving around based on this element, inside of this element. So now you can see we're starting where the image is at the top of this element and it's left 50% from this element. So one thing that is happening right now is padding is included in the width of the element. So it's actually starting 50% from the edge of the window. It's not starting 50% from like the edge of where we would normally want it to be. And you can see if I give it a width of 50%, we need to throw an important tag on there because Squarespace already had a width defined on this element. So if we go to the list item media, so it had an inline style of width 100%. So we just have to use an important tag in order to override that width of 100%. So if I take the important tag away, you'll see our style is crossed out because inline styles override not inline styles. Essentially, inline styles are more specific, so the only way to override an inline style is to add an important tag. Boom. Now our image is 50% of the width of the container. But again, it's 50% of the width of the entire container, and the container spans the entire screen. And we don't want it to be 50% of that. We want it to be 50% of the available space. So we need to make it less wide. And so basically what we can do is we can write a calculation that says subtract this space out of the calculation. So if I inspect this padding here is actually the site gutter, I believe they call it. And they keep a variable for it on the body tag, which is very helpful. So here's SQS site gutter is equal to 4 viewport width units. And this value comes from the design, site styles, spacing panel. So you can see we have the site margin set to 4 viewport width units. So if like the client were to come in and change this, I'll hit save. So that's now 5 viewport width units. If we inspect, our variable on the body should have updated to 5, and it did. So that's the nice thing, is we have access to this setting here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to subtract that 5 viewport width units from our 50% width, because we don't want it to take up this gutter space here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a calc function. So I'll say calc, and then because Squarespace, the CSS window uses the less preprocessor, we have to escape what we're going to be writing here. So again, that gets more detailed than I want to cover in this video, but essentially we're just going to target this variable here. So I'll write var, open up some parentheses, and then finish that off with a quotation mark, and then have the closing parenthesis. So now you can see the 50% is now subtracting that gutter amount, and it lines up perfectly on the left. So that's a good start. We'll leave that there for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at, if I open up this element, we'll take a look at the items again. And I'm going to take a look at the list item media. So right now, as I hover over it, it has margin on the bottom, and it has a margin bottom of 6%. So I just want to cancel that out. I want to make sure that there's no margin on this element. So I'm going to give it a margin bottom of 0. I'm going to add an important tag to override that inline style. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do is I want to give this a height of 100%. Because I want the image to, like, if we have more items here on the left, I want this image to make sure that it scales to fill the full container. So now, right now our third item is still over here and it's getting covered up by the image. So I want to make sure that I bring it around to the left over here. And so basically each of these items are placed in the grid. So if I hit this grid button, we should get a grid visualization on the screen. So now you can see that our grid is set to 2 columns. So we have a column here on the left and a column here on the right. So how do we bring this column or this item to the first column? Well, what we can do is we can target each item and we can tell them to start at the first grid column. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target each list item by their list item class. So I'm going to go dot list item, open up some curly brackets, and I'm going to give it a property of grid column start. So now we're speaking the CSS grid language, and I'm going to say I want it to start at the first column. And boom, now we get every item that we add is going to start at the first grid column. So even though we have it set to 2 in the settings for this section, each of them are only going to be over here on the right, which is exactly what we want. Okay, let me clear out that grid. So our image still isn't 100% height. And I want to see what's going on. Okay. So right now the image is getting its height based on the aspect ratio set on the image. And in the site settings, I have the aspect ratio set to 4:3. So what I have to do is basically just zero out this padding because I don't want the height to come from the padding. I want the height to come from the height of the media container. And the media height container we've set to be 100% height. So basically I want the image to be however tall this container is. So what we have to do is target this list item media inner class. So I'll come down and I'll add a period to target the class, open up some curly brackets, and I'll say padding bottom 0 important. And now I'm going to give it a height of 100%. Let's see. Okay, so our height is being canceled out because Squarespace is using more classes to target this element to give it a height of 0 than I am. I'm only using two selectors, and they're using 1, 2, and then this third not selector here. So in order to override Squarespace's more specific styling, I'm just going to add an important tag. Now you can see however tall these items are over here on the left, our image is going to be that tall over here on the right. So again, exactly what we want. Now, one thing that is happening right now, so if I hover over the image, let me go ahead and enable the grid again. Okay, so our image is basically too far over. So we would expect it to start at this grid line over here, but instead it's going like halfway here. And so what we need to do is basically we need to identify a grid value that we can then divide by 2. And that probably didn't make a lot of sense, but I think if I just go ahead and do it, it'll make more sense. Because remember, our image is taking up 50% of this whole container, so it's just going to go right in the middle. But we have a grid gap set up in the site's in the section settings. You can go in and set a gap between the elements. Right now I have it set to 20 pixels. So the image is not respecting that 20 pixel gap. It's just going right to the center of the section. So what we need to do is we need to basically move it over 50% minus half of this value. So since it's set to 20, half of it would be 10. So what I could do is in this left, we're also going to do another calculation. Again, because Squarespace uses the less preprocessor, I have to escape my parentheses here. And so we'll do 50% minus, and I'll do 10 pixels for now, just to show you how this works. And now we can see the image is starting where we would expect it to if I hover over it. Let's see. Oh, I think I have to do plus actually. There we go. Okay. So we're moving it to the left 50%, plus we're moving it over 10 pixels because that's half of that grid value. And now you can see the image lines up with the grid line. But, you know, people might want to change this. Just hard coding in 10 pixels isn't like always the best idea. So what we can do is we can come up here and we can create a variable called grid gap. And we can set this to 20 pixels. And now I can just target this variable. So we're going to do plus, and then the way that we can add in that variable is to do an @ sign and then open up curly brackets, and we'll do the name of the variable, grid gap. And now it's just taking that value from the variable here and putting it into our calculation. Except we want to divide the grid gap by 2. So we don't want it to be 20 pixels, we want it to be 10 pixels. And the nice thing about that is basically whatever value that you go in and set up inside of the section styles, you can then just update the variable here and it's going to match perfectly. So if I get rid of the grid, let's see, will it let me? Nope. Okay, that's okay. I'll just close the window. So basically the gap that I'm talking about, if we edit the section, we'll go to edit content, design, we'll go to size and space, and they have the space between items. So that's this value here. So this is the gap that I was talking about. And we only care about the column gap because that's the gap between the columns here. So basically if you were to increase this value here, let's go like 50 pixels, you would just then want to update this value here to 50 pixels. And that ensures that the image and the items are like actually perfectly centered on the page. So if I bring up my inspect window, you can see that the image is starting like correctly on the grid line. Okay, so hopefully that made some sense. And then if you wanted this space here to match that space, then you can just change the row gap. We only changed the column gap, but you can change both. So we'll go to design, size and space, and then you can make space between rows 50 also, and now you get like very symmetrical gap there. Chris from the future here. As I was editing the video, I realized I did my calculations a little bit wrong. We need one extra step. So because we've moved the image over to the left 50% plus now the grid gap amount divided by 2 to get it lined up perfectly over here, we've shifted the image a little, that grid gap amount divided by 2, we've shifted over the image that much to the right. So we basically need to subtract that amount from the width of the image and then it'll line up perfectly on the right. So all we have to do is copy this grid gap divided by 2 and we'll subtract it from the width of the image. So after this variable here, I'm going to add a space and then subtract the grid gap divided by 2. And now you'll see that the image lines up perfectly with the rest of the content on this side. So that's just one little edit that we have to make to get it to line up perfectly. And now we can get back to the regularly scheduled content. Okay, so right now we have everything kind of set up how we want it to be set up. The only thing is we don't have our hover effect set up. So basically when we hover over an item, we want that item's image to be visible. So what we can do is we can come down, well actually let's see. The first thing that we want to do is we want to set the list item media. We want to give each one an opacity of 0 because when we're hovering over an item, we only want that item's image to be visible. So now as I'll come down here and I'll say .list item. As we hover over a list item, so I'll say list item hover. We're then going to target this list item media. So I'll do space list item media. And I'm going to open up some curly brackets. Get everything situated here. Okay, give myself a little extra space. All right, so as we hover over a list item, we're going to target the list item media within that item, and we're going to give the image an opacity of 1. So as I hover over this one, that image shows, that image shows, and that image shows. So you can see as we hover over each item, the corresponding image is showing. That's perfect. But we don't want it to just kind of like be really abrupt like that. It would be nice if there was a fade in and out. So what we can do is we can come to the list item media, and I'll put a transition on it. Transition point, let's do 0.5 seconds, ease, and we only want it to transition the opacity. So now you can see there's a nice fade in and out. But you can see there's nothing showing, and we want the first item to show when nothing is hovered over. Now you'll notice if you just hover over any of the images here on the right, it shows the last image, and we don't necessarily want that to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and target the list item media, and I'm going to give it a pointer events of none. And the pointer events property, when we set it to none, it basically just says ignore the cursor. So as I hover over this image container over here, nothing is happening. So if I hover the second, it's showing. If I hover the third, it's showing. By default, the first one is going to show. So that's kind of the extent of our hover animation. I'm trying to think of just little things that could be done. You could set up a background color as each item is hovered over. So for example, we could do list item hover, and we can set the background color to be like gray, for example. It looks like I might need to add an important tag. Let's see, list item background color. Okay, yeah, so they're using many more selectors than I am, so I'm just going to go ahead and add an important tag. And now as you hover over it, you can see the background color changes, but you might want to also add a transition to the list item. And instead of opacity, we'll transition the background color. Okay, so now we get a nice subtle fade of the background color as each item is being hovered over. So it just kind of, I don't know, just is a nice way to display like 3 services as opposed to just having them in the cards. If we go down to the mobile view, it's still trying to keep the image to the right. So we would probably not want this to apply on mobile. We would only want all of this to apply on desktop. So what I can do is come in here, and I'm going to keep this variable inside of the data section ID. And that will prevent conflicts if you were to use this CSS more than once and then set different variable values. It'll limit the scope of this variable to just the section that you're writing it in. Okay, so I'm going to add a media query at media screen, and we're going to limit this to just screen sizes bigger than 700 and bigger than mobile, essentially. So on screen sizes 768 pixels and larger, this will apply. On screen sizes smaller than that, so on mobile, we'll just get the normal card view for these services. So that's kind of the best way to display things on mobile anyway. But if we go to desktop, we get this cool hover interaction. So let me know what you think of this tutorial. This was kind of complex. We got into CSS grid and hovers and calc functions and variables. So there's kind of a lot to unpack in this one, but let me know if you're able to follow somewhat. And hopefully this kind of opens your eyes to some fun things that we can do a little more advanced inside of Squarespace. All right, if you enjoyed this tutorial, consider subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.